The envelope arrived on the worst day of Marcus Webb's life. Not because of what it contained, but because it came 6 hours after the bank had slapped a foreclosure notice on his ranch in Arizona. 42 years old, widowed for 3, and now about to lose the only thing his late wife Emma had loved besides him. The letter was from a lawyer in Nevada, informing him that his Uncle Frank, a man he'd met exactly twice in his entire life, had died and left him property. 200 acres in Dry Creek Valley and everything on it. Marcus almost threw the letter away. He knew enough about his uncle's reputation to understand that anything Frank Webb owned was probably worthless. But before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The old man had been called crazy by everyone who knew him, obsessed with a dying horse and paranoid about developers. But desperation makes you consider things you'd normally ignore. So Marcus loaded what little he owned into his rusted pickup truck and drove north into Nevada, toward an inheritance he was certain would be his final disappointment. When he arrived 3 days later, standing at the edge of the property under a merciless desert sun, he understood why nobody had wanted this land. It stretched before him like a monument to failure, cracked earth splitting under the heat, sagebrush clinging to life in defiance of all logic. The barn leaned so far to one side it seemed held up by stubbornness alone. A windmill creaked in the hot wind, its blades spinning uselessly. This wasn't land. It was a graveyard for dreams. Marcus walked toward the barn, boots crunching on ground that hadn't seen rain in months. The smell hit him first, decay and dust and something else, something that made his stomach turn. Inside the barn, in a stall filled with filthy straw, lay a horse. She was dark bay, her coat dull and matted, ribs pressing against skin like prison bars. Her breathing came in shallow, rattling gasps. A crooked white blaze ran down her face, the only mark of distinction on a body that was clearly dying. This was Ember, his uncle's horse, the animal Frank had apparently spent his last dollar trying to keep alive. Marcus stood frozen, his rodeo-injured shoulder aching as it always did when storms approached. He'd seen dying horses before. The kind thing, the right thing, would be to end her suffering. But something stopped him. Maybe it was the way her eye followed him when he moved. Maybe it was exhaustion from 3 days of driving with nowhere else to go. Maybe it was the memory of Emma's voice telling him that giving up was the only unforgivable sin. He knelt in the straw beside Ember, and she made a sound, not quite a whinny, more like a question. Her dark eye held his, and Marcus felt something crack open inside his chest. The same place that had sealed shut the day he buried his wife. This horse was dying on worthless land that couldn't support a cactus, and he was a broke rancher with 90 days until the bank took his home. They were both at the end. Marcus spent his first night in Nevada sleeping on the floor of the barn beside Ember. The house his uncle had lived in was worse than the barn, windows broken, roof sagging, rooms filled with newspapers and maps covered in frantic handwriting. Whatever Frank Webb had been searching for in his final years had consumed him completely. But the barn, despite its lean, still had 4 walls and a roof. It would do. In the pale light of dawn, Marcus examined Ember more carefully. She was worse than he'd thought. Dehydration had hollowed her out, her gums were pale, and when he pressed his palm against her neck, her skin barely moved back into place. The water trough was bone dry, cracked at the bottom. His uncle had died 2 weeks ago, and Ember had been alone since then, slowly dying of thirst and starvation in a place the world had forgotten. Marcus found a bucket, walked to the windmill, and spent 20 minutes coaxing water from a well that was nearly dry. When he brought the first bucket back, Ember couldn't lift her head. He dipped his hand in the water and let it drip onto her lips. Nothing. He tried again, whispering to her the way Emma used to whisper to frightened animals. "Come on, girl. Don't quit on me now. We've both got too much fight left to give up here." On the third try, Ember's tongue moved. Just slightly, but enough. Marcus kept dripping water onto her mouth, patient, persistent, until finally she swallowed. It wasn't much, but it was something. Over the next hours, Marcus worked with the kind of focus he hadn't felt in years. He found grain in a sealed bin, mixed it with water into a mash, and coaxed Ember to take tiny amounts. He hauled water bucket by bucket from the struggling well. He cleaned the stall, replacing the fouled straw with the cleanest he could find in the barn's small loft. His shoulders screamed with every lift, every carry, but he ignored it. Pain was just noise. By midday, the heat was suffocating. Marcus had stripped to his undershirt, sweat pouring down his back, when he heard a truck approaching. He walked out of the barn to find a woman climbing out of a dusty pickup. She was maybe 50, lean and weathered, with gray streaking through her dark hair. She walked with a noticeable limp, favoring her left leg. "Rita Callahan," she said, not offering her hand. "Run the general store in Silver Ridge." Heard Frank's nephew finally showed up. Marcus nodded. "That'd be me." Rita looked past him toward the barn, then scanned the property with an expression that made clear what she thought of it. "Your uncle owed me $300 when he died. Don't expect you to pay it, but figured I'd mention it." Marcus didn't have $300. Didn't have 30. "I'll keep it in mind," he said. Rita's eyes narrowed. "You planning to stay, or just came to look at your inheritance before you sell to Dalton Pierce?" The name meant nothing to Marcus. "Who's Dalton Pierce?" Rita laughed, sharp and bitter. "The man who's been trying to buy this land for 5 years. Developer from California. Wants to build some kind of resort community out here. Offered Frank a fortune for this place. Your uncle told him to go straight to hell." Marcus looked at the barren landscape around him. "Resort community? Here?" Rita shrugged. "Dalton sees something the rest of us don't. Or he's just as crazy as your uncle was. Either way, he'll come calling soon enough. Now that Frank's dead, he'll figure you're desperate enough to sell." She wasn't wrong about the desperate part. Marcus watched her climb back into her truck, then returned to the barn. Ember was breathing a little easier now, her eye following him as he moved around the stall. He sat down in the straw beside her, his back against the wall, and closed his eyes. The smart thing would be to sell. Take whatever Dalton Pierce offered, pay off the bank in Arizona, and start over somewhere else. But Emma's voice echoed in his memory again. Starting over just means running away with a different zip code. She'd said that when he wanted to quit the rodeo after his shoulder injury. Said it again when her cancer came back and he wanted to rage at God. Starting over just means running away. Marcus opened his eyes and looked at Ember. "I don't know what Uncle Frank saw in you, girl. Don't know what he was looking for out here. But he didn't quit, and I guess that means something. So we'll stay. At least for a while. See if we can figure out what the old man knew that everybody else didn't." Ember's ear flicked toward him. The first real movement she'd made that wasn't just reflex. Marcus took it as agreement. That night, he dragged a cot into the barn and set it up outside Ember's stall. Every few hours he woke to check on her, offering water, adjusting her position to prevent sores, talking to her in the darkness about Emma, about the ranch in Arizona, about how they'd both ended up in this desperate place. He told her things he'd never said out loud, grief and anger and fear spilling out in whispers. Ember listened, her breathing steady, her eye occasionally catching the moonlight that filtered through gaps in the barn walls. On the third morning, Marcus woke to find Ember standing. Barely. Her legs shook like branches in a storm, but she was on her feet. He scrambled up, his heart hammering, and moved slowly toward her. "Easy, girl. Easy. You don't have to prove anything yet." But Ember wasn't trying to prove anything. She was looking toward the barn door, toward something outside. Marcus followed her gaze but saw nothing except the same barren landscape. Still, there was something in the way Ember stood, something in the intensity of her focus, that made Marcus wonder if his uncle's obsession with this horse had been about more than just stubbornness. He stepped outside the barn, and preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story, and looked where Ember seemed to be staring. All he saw was the dried-up creek bed that ran through the property, a scar in the earth leading toward the rocky hills in the distance. Near those hills, maybe half a mile away, Marcus could just make out what looked like old wooden boards, probably covering one of the abandoned mine shafts that dotted this part of Nevada. Nothing worth looking at. Nothing that explained why a dying horse would struggle to her feet just to stare in that direction. Marcus returned to the barn and offered Ember more water. This time she drank on her own, her muzzle dipping into the bucket, taking long, desperate pulls. When she finished, she looked at him with what Marcus could have sworn was gratitude, then carefully, painfully, lowered herself back down into the straw. "You're tougher than you look," Marcus said softly. His uncle had apparently said the same thing, often enough that it was scrawled on a piece of paper Marcus had found tacked to the barn wall. "Ember is tougher than she looks." Below that, in his uncle's increasingly frantic handwriting, was another note. "She knows. She always knows." Marcus didn't understand what Ember was supposed to know, but he was beginning to suspect that his uncle's madness might have had method in it. Something about this place, something about this horse, had kept a dying old man fighting until his last breath. And now that something was Marcus's to figure out. A week passed. Ember grew stronger each day, her coat beginning to show hints of the shine it must have once had. Marcus patched the roof, fixed the windmill to pull water more efficiently, and started clearing the property of decades of neglect. He avoided the house, which felt like stepping into his uncle's deteriorating mind, and instead made the barn his home. Rita came by twice more, each time bringing supplies she claimed were leftovers. Bread that was only a day old. Cans of soup she said she couldn't sell. Marcus knew charity when he saw it, but he also knew pride was expensive when you were broke, so he accepted without comment. On her third visit, she stayed longer, leaning against the fence while Marcus worked. Ember had ventured out of the barn for the first time that morning, standing in the small corral Marcus had repaired, letting the sun warm her back. "You got her looking almost alive," Rita said. There was something different in her voice now, less sharp, almost impressed. Marcus wiped sweat from his face. "She's a fighter." Rita was quiet for a moment, then said, "Your uncle loved that horse more than anything. Near the end, people thought he'd lost his mind completely. Used to talk about Ember like she was some kind of oracle. Said she was trying to show him something important." "Did he ever figure out what?" Marcus asked. Rita shook her head. "If he did, he died before he could prove it. Dalton Pierce used to send people out here trying to convince Frank to sell. Your uncle would just point at Ember and say the horse knows why this land matters. Drove Dalton crazy." Marcus looked at Ember, who was pawing at the ground with her front hoof, not randomly, but in the same spot over and over. She'd been doing that for 2 days now, always in the same place, always with the same deliberate motion. "What do you know about the mines out here?" Marcus asked. Rita followed his gaze toward the hills. "Old copper mines, most of them. Played out 60 years ago." "Why?" Marcus shrugged, not wanting to sound as crazy as his uncle. "Just curious." After Rita left, Marcus walked to where Ember had been pawing. The ground there looked no different from anywhere else, just packed earth and rock. But Ember kept returning to it, kept pawing, kept staring toward those distant hills where the old mine entrance sat boarded up and forgotten. That night, Marcus sat on the barn floor with maps he'd pulled from his uncle's house spread around him. They were geological surveys, old mining reports, property deeds going back 100 years. His uncle had marked them extensively, circles and arrows and notes that seemed random until Marcus started piecing them together. Every mark pointed to the same conclusion. Frank Webb had believed there was something valuable on this property. Not in the old mine that had been exhausted decades ago, but somewhere else. Something the original miners had missed. Something that Ember somehow knew about. Marcus knew how insane it sounded. He could hear what Rita would say, what anyone would say. "You're as crazy as your uncle was." But crazy or not, Marcus had nothing left to lose. And Ember, now strong enough to walk the property, kept returning to that same spot, kept pawing at the ground, kept looking toward the hills with an intensity that couldn't be ignored. On the 10th day, Dalton Pierce arrived. He came in a black luxury SUV that looked obscene against the desert landscape. His suit too expensive, his smile too white, his handshake too firm. Marcus met him outside the barn, Ember watching from the corral. "Mr. Webb," Dalton said, his voice smooth as silk. I'm so sorry for your loss. Your uncle was quite a character. Marcus said nothing, just waited. Dalton's smile widened. I'll cut right to it. I know you're in a difficult position. This land isn't worth much to anyone but me. I'm prepared to offer you $200,000. Cash. Today. You can walk away, start fresh. It was more money than Marcus had ever seen in his life. More than enough to save his ranch in Arizona, to rebuild, to survive. But he thought of Emma, of what she would say. He thought of his uncle, who'd turned down the same offer while everyone called him crazy. And he thought of Ember, still pawing at that spot of ground. I'm not interested, Marcus said. Dalton's smile faltered. Mr. Webb, be reasonable. This land is worthless. No water, no grazing, no potential. Whatever your uncle told you. He was a sick old man with delusions. Marcus felt anger rise in his chest. My uncle held onto this place when everyone told him to give up. I figure I owe it to him to at least understand why before I make any decisions. Dalton's expression hardened, the friendly mask slipping. You have 90 days before the bank takes your ranch in Arizona. I know because I checked. In 90 days you'll have nothing. Take my offer while it stands. Marcus stepped closer, close enough to see Dalton's jaw tighten. I got nothing to lose then, do I? That means I can afford to wait and see what happens. You can't. Dalton Pierce climbed back into his SUV without another word. But as he drove away, Marcus saw him on his phone, animated, angry. Whatever Dalton wanted this land for, it wasn't a resort. And Marcus was going to find out what it was, even if it meant following a dying horse's instincts into the desert heat. Even if it meant everyone in Silver Ridge thought he'd inherited more than just his uncle's land. He'd inherited his madness too. But that night, sitting beside Ember as stars filled the sky, Marcus didn't feel crazy. He felt, for the first time since Emma died, like he had a purpose. Like maybe being broke and desperate and left with nothing was exactly where he needed to be to find something worth everything. The sun had barely crept over the horizon when Marcus found himself standing at the spot where Ember kept pawing the ground. He'd brought a shovel from the barn, its handle worn smooth by his uncle's hands, and now he stared at the earth wondering if he'd completely lost his mind. The air was still cool, that brief window before the Nevada desert turned into an oven, and Marcus could hear Ember moving in the corral behind him, her hooves scraping against packed dirt in that same deliberate pattern she'd shown for days. He drove the shovel into the ground. The earth resisted, baked hard by years of sun, but Marcus had spent his life doing physical labor that fought back. His shoulder protested immediately, that old rodeo injury sending sharp signals up his neck, but he ignored it the way he'd learned to ignore most pain. You didn't survive in ranching by listening to your body's complaints. You survived by pushing through until the work was done or you dropped, whichever came first. After an hour of digging, Marcus had excavated a hole about 3 feet deep and 4 feet across. Nothing. Just more dirt, a few rocks, the occasional root from some long-dead plant. He was about to give up, to accept that he'd wasted his morning chasing the delusions of a dead man and a horse that probably just had a nervous habit, when his shovel struck something that rang metallic. Marcus dropped to his knees, using his hands now to brush away the dirt. Metal emerged, a pipe of some kind, running horizontally through the ground. It was old, corroded in places, but still intact. Marcus traced it with his fingers, trying to understand what he'd found. It wasn't a water pipe, too large for that and running in the wrong direction. It seemed to be heading toward the hills, toward that old mine entrance. He sat back on his heels, breathing hard, his shirt soaked with sweat despite the early hour. A pipe running from the middle of nowhere toward an abandoned mine. His uncle's maps spread across the barn floor suddenly made more sense. Frank hadn't been marking random locations. He'd been tracking something, following a trail that most people couldn't see because they weren't looking. Ember nickered from the corral, a sound Marcus had learned meant she wanted his attention. He climbed out of the hole and walked over to her. She was standing at the fence line, staring toward the hills again, that same intense focus she always had. Marcus reached out and stroked her neck, feeling the muscle that had started to rebuild beneath her coat. You knew, didn't you? He said quietly. Whatever Uncle Frank was looking for, you knew where it was. The question is, how does a horse know something like that? The sound of an engine pulled Marcus's attention away from Ember. Another vehicle was approaching, but this wasn't the luxury SUV Dalton Pierce drove. This was a beat-up ranch truck, the kind held together by rust and prayer. It pulled to a stop near the barn, and a young man climbed out, maybe 25, with dark hair and nervous eyes. Marcus walked over, hand instinctively moving to the work knife on his belt. He didn't know this kid, didn't trust unexpected visitors. Not after Dalton's thinly veiled threats. "You Marcus Webb?" the young man asked, his voice carrying an accent that suggested he'd grown up speaking Spanish before English. "Depends on who's asking." The young man looked at the ground, at the hills, at anywhere except Marcus's face. "Name's Tommy Vega. I worked for your uncle sometimes, helping with repairs and such. Heard you were out here, thought maybe you could use a hand." Marcus studied him. Tommy was lying, or at least not telling the whole truth. It was there in his body language, the way his fingers tapped against his thigh, the way his eyes darted. But Marcus also recognized desperation when he saw it, recognized the look of someone carrying guilt like a physical weight. "What's the real reason you're here, Tommy?" Tommy finally met his eyes, and Marcus saw genuine anguish there. "I owed your uncle. He was good to me when most people in Silver Ridge treated me like trash. I heard Dalton Pierce came out here, heard he's putting pressure on you to sell. Figured you should know some things about what's really going on." Marcus gestured toward the barn. "Come on, let's talk in the shade." Inside the barn, Marcus offered Tommy water from the bucket, and they sat on hay bales while Ember watched from her stall. The horse had taken to staying close to the barn during the hottest parts of the day, conserving her energy, but her eyes tracked every movement, every gesture. Tommy drank deeply, then set the tin cup down with shaking hands. "I need to tell you something, and you're probably going to want to hit me after. I work for Dalton Pierce. Or I did. He hired me 2 years ago to keep an eye on your uncle, report back on what Frank was doing out here." Marcus felt anger flare hot in his chest, but he kept his voice level. "You were spying on a dying old man." Tommy nodded miserably. "I needed the money. My sister, she's got medical bills, and Dalton paid cash. But your uncle, he figured it out pretty quick. Caught me looking through his papers one day. I thought he'd run me off, maybe even shoot me. Instead, he sat me down and talked to me like I was worth something. Asked about my sister, about why I'd taken Dalton's money. Then he told me something." "What?" Tommy looked at Ember, his expression a mixture of awe and fear. "He said that horse knew secrets the earth was trying to keep. Said Ember could sense things underground, could find water in places everyone swore was dry, could lead him to things that shouldn't be found. I thought he was crazy, told Dalton as much. But then I watched Ember find 3 different water sources on this property that every surveyor said didn't exist. Watched her paw at a spot that turned out to have an old well nobody knew about. Your uncle started following her, started believing she was showing him something bigger." Marcus thought about the pipe he'd just uncovered, the maps in the house, Ember's persistent focus on that one area. What was he looking for? Tommy pulled something from his pocket, a folded piece of paper worn soft from handling. "Your uncle gave me this the last time I saw him, about a month before he died. He said if anything happened to him, I should give it to whoever inherited the property. Said they'd need to know the truth." Marcus unfolded the paper. His uncle's handwriting covered it, shaky but still legible. Most of it was technical, geological terms Marcus barely understood, but the core message was clear. Frank Webb had believed there was a massive underground aquifer running beneath the property, fed by snowmelt from mountains 50 miles away, flowing through ancient rock channels that conventional surveys couldn't detect. In a region where water was more valuable than gold, where cities were running dry and drought was choking the Southwest, an aquifer of that size would be worth hundreds of millions of dollars. "Dalton knows," Tommy said quietly. "He's known for years. That's why he wants this land. He's got investors lined up, plans to tap into that aquifer and sell water rights to Las Vegas, Phoenix, Los Angeles. But he needs the land first, needs it before anyone else figures out what's underneath." Marcus felt the weight of the paper in his hands, understanding now why his uncle had fought so hard, why he'd seemed crazy to everyone. Frank Webb had been sitting on a fortune that he couldn't prove existed, wouldn't sell even though he was dying poor, because he knew what men like Dalton Pierce would do with that much water in a thirsty world. How does Ember fit into this? Marcus asked. Tommy shrugged helplessly. I don't know. Your uncle tried to explain it once, something about horses being sensitive to electromagnetic fields, to underground water sources. Wild horses in the desert, they can find water when everything says there shouldn't be any. But Ember, she's different. It's like she doesn't just sense water, she understands it. Your uncle thought maybe she'd spent time near the aquifer as a foal, that she'd imprinted on it somehow. Marcus stood and walked to Ember's stall. The horse watched him approach, her dark eye reflecting the dim light filtering through the barn walls. He reached out and she pressed her muzzle into his palm, warm breath against his skin. Can you prove any of this? Marcus asked without turning around. That's the problem, Tommy said. Your uncle tried. He hired independent surveyors, hydrogeologists, anyone who'd listen. But the aquifer is deep, the rock formation's complex. Nobody could confirm it existed with standard equipment. And Dalton has connections, money. He made sure anyone your uncle hired either got paid off or discredited. That's why Frank gave up on proving it legally. He decided to just hold onto the land until he could figure out another way. But he ran out of time. Tommy nodded. And now Dalton thinks you'll be easier to deal with. Thinks you're just some broke rancher who'll take the money and run. He doesn't know about the letter I just gave you. Doesn't know your uncle left you the research. Marcus turned back to Tommy, seeing the young man in a new light. Why are you telling me this? Why betray Dalton? Because I watched your uncle die still fighting for this place. Tommy said, his voice thick with emotion. Because my sister's medical bills are paid off now, and I don't need Dalton's blood money anymore. And because your uncle told me something the last time I saw him. He said that men like Dalton Pierce take until there's nothing left, but men like us, we're supposed to protect things. Protect the land, protect the water, protect what's right even when it costs us everything. The barn fell silent except for the sound of Ember shifting in her stall, her hooves scraping against wood in that familiar pattern. Marcus looked at the letter again, at his uncle's desperate handwriting, and felt the weight of inheritance settle fully on his shoulders. Frank Webb hadn't left him worthless land. He'd left him a responsibility, a fight that had killed him and would probably destroy Marcus too. But Emma's voice echoed again in his memory. The things worth protecting are usually the things that fight back the hardest. All right, Marcus said, folding the letter and putting it in his pocket. If this aquifer exists, we need to prove it. Not with surveys Dalton can interfere with, but something undeniable. Something that can't be hidden or bought off. Tommy stood, a spark of hope lighting his features for the first time since he'd arrived. What do you need? Marcus walked to the barn door and looked toward the hills, toward that old mine entrance that Ember kept staring at. We need to follow the pipe I found this morning. See where it leads. If my uncle was right, if there really is an aquifer down there, there has to be some kind of access point. Those old miners were digging for copper, but maybe they found something else and didn't realize what they had. That mine's been sealed for decades, Tommy said. Could be dangerous. Marcus smiled grimly. Everything worth doing usually is. They spent the rest of the day preparing. Marcus had some old climbing rope in the truck, flashlights that barely worked, and a stubborn refusal to accept that this was impossible. Tommy proved useful, his hands quick and his knowledge of the property more extensive than Marcus had expected. As they worked, Tommy talked about his time with Frank, about the old man's theories and observations. Your uncle used to sit out here at night, Tommy said as they coiled rope, just watching Ember. He said she moved differently depending on what was underground. Said she could tell him where water was flowing even when everything looked dry. I thought it was just an old man talking to his horse, you know? But then I started paying attention, and I'll be damned if he wasn't right. How did he get Ember in the first place? Marcus asked. Found her as a foal, Tommy said. She was with a band of wild Mustangs that came through about 8 years ago. Most of them moved on, but Ember stayed. She was young, maybe just weaned, and something about this place called to her. Your uncle spent months gaining her trust, and once he did, That's when he started noticing her behavior. That's when he started believing there was something special under this ground. Marcus thought about that, about a wild horse choosing to stay in a place everyone else abandoned, about an old man crazy enough to listen to what an animal was trying to tell him. It sounded insane, the kind of story people would laugh at over beers at the Dusty Saddle Saloon. But Marcus had seen Ember's intensity, had felt the certainty in his uncle's words, even filtered through Tommy's retelling. As the sun began its descent toward the horizon, painting the desert in shades of orange and red, Marcus stood at the fence watching Ember. The horse had been restless all afternoon, pacing the corral, occasionally stopping to paw at the ground or stare toward the hills. She knew something was coming, some change in the pattern of their days. Tomorrow, Marcus told her. Tomorrow we follow where you've been trying to lead us. Ember's ear swiveled toward him, and she walked over to the fence. Marcus reached through the rails and stroked her neck, feeling the strength that had returned to her body. She'd come back from the edge of death, had fought her way back to life with the same stubbornness his uncle had shown. Whatever tomorrow brought, Marcus knew Ember would be part of it. That night, Tommy slept in the barn while Marcus took the cot near Ember's stall. He lay awake long into the darkness, thinking about aquifers and water rights, about dead uncles and dying horses, about the way desperation could make you believe in impossible things. His shoulder ached, a constant reminder of the moment his rodeo career had ended, the moment everything had started to fall apart. But maybe falling apart was necessary. Maybe you had to hit bottom before you could see what was really underneath. In the darkness, Ember's breathing was a steady rhythm, peaceful and sure. Marcus closed his eyes and let that rhythm carry him toward sleep, toward dreams of underground rivers and wild horses who knew secrets the earth tried to keep. Tomorrow they would follow the pipe, would venture into an abandoned mine, would chase the ghost of his uncle's obsession into the darkness beneath the desert. But tonight, in the quiet of the barn, Marcus felt something he hadn't felt in years. He felt like he was exactly where he was supposed to be, doing exactly what he was meant to do. Even if it killed him, even if everyone thought he was as crazy as Frank Webb, Marcus was going to find out what Ember knew. He was going to prove his uncle right. And he was going to make sure that whatever fortune lay beneath this worthless land didn't end up in the hands of men who only knew how to take. The desert wind picked up outside, whistling through gaps in the barn walls, carrying with it the scent of creosote and dust. Marcus pulled the thin blanket tighter and listened to that wind, to Ember's breathing, to the sound of his own heart beating steady and strong. He was broke, desperate, and about to do something probably suicidal. But for the first time since Emma died, Marcus Webb felt alive. The mine entrance looked even more forbidding up close than it had from a distance. Marcus and Tommy stood before it in the early morning light, their shadows stretching long across the rocky ground. Wooden boards that had once sealed the opening had rotted and fallen away over the years, leaving a dark mouth in the hillside that seemed to breathe cold air even in the desert heat. Rusted metal supports framed the entrance, and scattered around the opening were the remnants of the old mining operation. Broken equipment, coils of ancient cable, the skeletal remains of a wooden cart with wheels that had long since disintegrated. Marcus played his flashlight beam into the darkness. The tunnel descended at a shallow angle, shored up with timber supports that looked alarmingly fragile. Water stains marked the walls, rust-colored streaks that suggested moisture had once flowed through here, maybe still did during the rare times rain fell in these parts. The air that wafted from the mine carried a mineral smell, earth and copper and something else Marcus couldn't quite identify. Ember had followed them from the barn, something Marcus hadn't planned but couldn't prevent. The horse stood behind them now, her attention fixed on the mine entrance with that same unwavering focus she'd shown for weeks. She took a step forward, then another, and before Marcus could react she was at the entrance itself. Her muzzle extended toward the darkness as if scenting something only she could perceive. "She wants to go in," Tommy said, his voice uncertain. "That's impossible, right? Horses don't go into mines." Marcus thought about everything Tommy had told him, about his uncle's observations, about Ember's uncanny ability to sense what lay underground. Wild mustangs could navigate terrain that would kill a domestic horse, could find their way through conditions that seemed impossible. And Ember wasn't just any Mustang. She'd survived abandonment and near death, had recovered with a determination that defied logic. "She's come this far," Marcus said finally. "Maybe she knows something we don't." They entered the mine with Marcus leading, flashlight in one hand and rope coiled over his shoulder. Tommy came next, carrying a second light and a pack with water and basic supplies. Ember followed behind them, her hooves loud on the stone floor, echoing in the confined space. Marcus had expected her to balk, to refuse to enter, but instead she moved with confidence, as if this dark tunnel was exactly where she needed to be. The temperature dropped as they descended. The shaft ran straight for maybe 50 yards, then began to curve and branch. Side tunnels opened off the main passage, some partially collapsed, others disappearing into darkness that their lights couldn't penetrate. Marcus checked his uncle's map, the one he'd found in the house marked with what now seemed like navigational notes rather than the ravings of a paranoid mind. According to this, Marcus said, "Stopping at an intersection where 3 tunnels converged, we want to take the right passage." Uncle Frank marked it as the deepest shaft, the one that goes down toward the aquifer level. "How did he know which way to go?" Tommy asked, his light playing across the ceiling where ancient timbers sagged under the weight of the earth above. Marcus was about to say he didn't know when Ember pushed past them both, moving without hesitation down the right-hand tunnel. The horse's certainty was absolute, her stride never faltering even though the passage here was narrow and the ceiling low enough that Marcus had to duck. "She knows," Marcus said quietly. "God help me, but she actually knows." They followed Ember deeper into the earth. The tunnel twisted and turned, descended steep sections where wooden ladders had rotted away, and they had to use the rope to lower themselves carefully. Time lost meaning in the darkness. Marcus's watch said they'd been underground for an hour, but it felt both longer and shorter than that. His shoulder burned with the effort of climbing and the constant bracing against stone walls, but he pushed the pain aside. The tunnel eventually opened into a larger chamber, a space where the old miners had clearly spent significant time. The walls showed drill marks, and there were remnants of a track system or carts. But what caught Marcus's attention was the sound. A faint rushing noise, like wind through trees, except there was no wind down here. It was water, moving somewhere below them or beyond the walls. A sound so subtle he might have missed it if Ember hadn't stopped in the center of the chamber and pawed at the floor. Marcus knelt where Ember had been pawing. The stone here was different, darker, and when he pressed his hand against it he could feel vibration, a thrumming that came from deep below. He looked up at Tommy, whose eyes had gone wide. "You feel that?" Marcus asked. Tommy nodded, kneeling beside him. "Something's moving down there. Something big." Marcus pulled out his uncle's map again, studying it in the flashlight beam. Frank had marked this chamber specifically, had written notes in the margin that Marcus now read aloud. "Resonance point. Can hear the flow here. Estimate depth at 200 feet. Volume suggests major source. 200 feet, Tommy breathed. Even if we're right, how do we reach it? We'd need drilling equipment, permits, experts. Things we don't have and can't afford." But Marcus wasn't listening. He was watching Ember, who had moved to the far side of the chamber where the wall curved inward. The horse was investigating something, her muzzle pressed against the stone, breath steaming in the cold air. Marcus walked over and examined what had caught her attention. It was a fissure, a crack in the wall so narrow it was almost invisible. But when Marcus put his face close to it, he felt air moving, damp and cold, flowing from somewhere deep below. He pressed his ear against the opening and heard it clearly now, the unmistakable sound of running water, not a trickle but a substantial flow, a river moving through channels carved by time and pressure. "Tommy," Marcus called, "bring the rope." They spent the next 2 hours working at the fissure. The crack was wider than it first appeared, and when they managed to pry away some loose rock, they discovered it opened into a natural chimney that descended into darkness. Marcus dropped a stone through the opening and counted seconds until he heard a distant splash. 8 seconds. That meant the drop was somewhere around 300 feet, give or take. "This is insane," Tommy said, staring into the hole they'd exposed. "We can't go down there." We don't have the equipment, the training. If something goes wrong, nobody knows where we are. Marcus tested the rope, checking knots and anchor points. He'd done some climbing in his younger days before the rodeo injury, and while he wasn't an expert, he knew enough to be dangerous. My uncle spent years trying to prove this aquifer exists, he said. Dalton Pierce has spent just as long trying to steal it. If we walk away now, Dalton wins. He gets the land, he gets the water, and everything Uncle Frank fought for dies with him. So we risk dying to prove a dead man's theory? Marcus looked at Ember, who stood at the edge of the opening, staring down into darkness with that same intense focus. The horse had led them here, through miles of desert and hundreds of feet of tunnel, never wavering, never uncertain. Whatever instinct or sense guided her, it had been right about everything else. Why would it be wrong now? I'm going down, Marcus said. You can stay here if you want. I won't blame you. Tommy was quiet for a long moment, his light playing across the opening, the rope, Marcus's face. Then he sighed. Your uncle paid my sister's hospital bills when her insurance wouldn't cover the surgery. Paid them without telling anyone. Just showed up one day and handed my mom a cashier's check. I found out after he died, saw the bank records when I was helping sort his papers. I owe him everything. You don't owe him this, Marcus said. Maybe not. But I owe myself. I've spent 2 years taking money from Dalton Pierce for spying on a good man. Time I did something worth being proud of. They rigged the rope carefully, tying it off to the most stable rock formation they could find. Marcus would go first, descending into the chimney to see how far it went and what lay below. Tommy would stay at the top, managing the rope and ready to pull Marcus back up if needed. Ember would wait, which Marcus told himself was the smart plan even though every instinct said the horse should somehow be part of this. Marcus backed over the edge, feet finding purchase on the rough stone, hands gripping the rope. His shoulder immediately screamed in protest, but he'd expected that. Pain was just information, his old rodeo coach used to say. Tells you what's happening, but you choose whether to listen. Marcus chose to keep descending. The chimney was tight in places, forcing him to squeeze through gaps that barely accommodated his shoulders. In other spots it widened into small caves where he could rest, catching his breath, checking the rope above. His flashlight cast wild shadows on the walls, and he could feel moisture now, actual water seeping through cracks in the stone, cold against his skin. At one point the rope ran out and Marcus had to make a decision. He'd descended maybe 250 feet based on how much rope they'd brought, but the chimney kept going. Below him he could hear the water clearly now, a roar that suggested significant volume and flow. But to continue meant free climbing with no safety line, meant risking a fall that would kill him or trap him beyond rescue. Marcus pressed himself into a small alcove and looked up. The entrance was a tiny circle of light far above, Tommy's silhouette just barely visible. It would be easy to climb back, to say they'd done their best, to admit that proving the aquifer wasn't worth dying for. But then Marcus thought about Emma, about the way she'd faced her cancer with a stubbornness that terrified the doctors. She'd told him once that surrender was a choice, and choosing to fight even when you knew you'd lose was still better than giving up. He kept climbing down. The chimney finally opened into a cavern that took Marcus's breath away. His flashlight beam couldn't find the far walls, just revealed space that seemed to stretch endlessly. But what made his heart race was the sound, the unmistakable roar of moving water. And when he directed his light downward, he saw it. A river, no, bigger than a river, an underground stream at least 50 feet across, flowing through the cavern with power that churned and foamed where it hit rocks. The water was crystalline, clearer than anything Marcus had seen above ground, and it moved with the kind of force that spoke of pressure and volume and source that didn't depend on rainfall or season. His uncle had been right. The aquifer existed, and it was more impressive than any survey or report could have conveyed. Marcus made his way down the last section of the chimney, reaching a rocky shore where the underground river flowed. He knelt and put his hand in the water, feeling its cold bite, tasting it and finding it clean, pure, the kind of water that cities would pay fortunes to access. Around the cavern he could see other openings, other channels where water probably flowed in or out, a network of underground waterways that existed in a world most people didn't know was there. He pulled out his phone, hoping against hope that he'd somehow have signal this far down. Nothing, of course. But the camera still worked, and Marcus began documenting everything, taking photos and video of the river, the cavern, the obvious flow rate, and the crystalline quality of the water. Evidence that couldn't be denied or explained away. Marcus spent 20 minutes exploring what he could reach, finding more tunnels that led away from the main cavern, discovering what looked like mineral deposits on the walls that suggested this water had been flowing here for thousands of years. He filled a water bottle from the river, sealed it carefully, evidence that could be tested and verified. Then he began the long climb back up. The ascent was harder than the descent. His arms shook with exhaustion, his shoulder felt like someone was driving nails through the joint, and several times he had to stop and just hang on the rope, breathing hard, willing his body to keep moving. When he finally saw Tommy's face looking down through the opening, relief nearly overwhelmed him. Tommy helped pull him the last few feet, and Marcus collapsed on the cavern floor, gasping, his hands torn and bleeding from the rough stone. Ember immediately came over, pressing her muzzle against his shoulder as if checking that he was intact. "Did you find it?" Tommy asked, his voice tight with anxiety and hope. Marcus pulled out his phone, hands shaking, and showed Tommy the photos. The younger man's eyes went wide, then wider, and then he started laughing, a sound edged with hysteria and disbelief. "That's real? That's actually down there?" Marcus nodded, too exhausted to speak. He let Tommy watch the videos, let the evidence speak for itself. An underground river of that size, flowing through caverns that had probably never seen human presence before today, fed by sources that reached back into the mountains, where snowmelt filtered through rock and emerged in channels carved over millennia. Frank Webb had been right about everything, but proving it existed was only the first step. Now they had to figure out how to protect it, how to keep men like Dalton Pierce from taking it and turning it into profit while the desert died of thirst above. Marcus lay on the cold stone floor, Ember's warm breath against his face, and tried to think through exhaustion and pain to the next move. "We need to get this to someone who matters," Tommy said. "A newspaper, a government agency, someone who can verify what you found and stop Dalton before he files any claims." Marcus shook his head. "Dalton has connections, money, lawyers who can tie this up for years. By the time anyone official gets around to investigating, he'll have bought enough people to make it disappear. We need something bigger, something public that he can't suppress." "Like what?" Marcus didn't have an answer. He closed his eyes, his body screaming for rest, and tried to think. Ember pawed at the ground beside him, that familiar gesture, and Marcus opened his eyes to look at her. The horse was staring back toward the entrance of the mine, ears forward, body tense. "Someone's coming," Tommy whispered, his voice urgent. "I hear an engine." They moved as quickly as Marcus's exhausted body would allow, heading back through the tunnel toward the surface. Marcus carried the rope and his phone with its precious evidence, while Tommy gathered their other supplies. Ember led the way again, moving faster now, as if she sensed danger as clearly as she'd sensed the water below. When they emerged from the mine entrance, the sunlight was blinding after hours in darkness. Marcus squinted against it and saw 3 vehicles parked near the barn, black SUVs that screamed money and intimidation. Men in suits stood near them, and at the center was Dalton Pierce, his expression dark with fury. Beside Dalton was another man, older, wearing a sheriff's uniform. Marcus recognized him from his brief trip into Silver Ridge, Sheriff Coleman, who had a reputation for being practical about which side his bread was buttered on. The kind of man who understood that campaign donations and personal favors mattered more than abstract concepts like justice. "Mr. Webb," Dalton called out, his voice carrying across the distance. "I'm afraid you're trespassing. I've purchased this property from the county for unpaid taxes. As of this morning, you're standing on my land." Marcus felt the bottom drop out of his world. He looked at Tommy, whose face had gone pale. The taxes. In all the chaos of the last weeks, Marcus had forgotten about his uncle's back taxes, the debt that had accumulated over years of Frank refusing to sell. The county must have finally moved to collect, and Dalton had been waiting for exactly that opportunity. Sheriff Coleman stepped forward, hand resting on his belt near his weapon. "Sir, I'm going to need you to vacate this property. You've got until sundown to remove your belongings. After that, you'll be arrested for trespassing." Marcus's mind raced. Everything they'd found, all the evidence, meant nothing if he didn't own the land. Dalton had outmaneuvered him, had used the law itself as a weapon. And there was no way Marcus could come up with the money to pay the taxes, not in time to stop the sale. Ember moved then, stepping in front of Marcus, placing her body between him and the approaching sheriff. The horse's ears were flat back, her eyes showing white, and she pawed at the ground with enough force to throw dust into the air. It was a challenge, a refusal to yield, and something about it made Dalton laugh. "Even the horse knows when it's beaten," Dalton said. "Sheriff, remove these people from my property. Use whatever force is necessary." But as the sheriff moved forward, Ember reared, striking the air with her front hooves, a display of power and defiance that froze everyone in place. And in that moment, Marcus understood what his uncle had known all along. This wasn't about money or property rights or who had the better lawyers. This was about standing your ground when everything said you should run. This was about fighting for what mattered even when the fight was impossible to win. Marcus stepped forward to stand beside Ember, his hand on her neck, feeling the tension in her muscles. "You want this land, Dalton? Then you're going to have to explain to the world why you're willing to destroy an aquifer that could save the Southwest from drought. Because I have proof it exists, and I'm going to make sure everyone knows what you're really after." Dalton's smile faltered, just for a moment. "You're bluffing. You've got nothing but the delusions of a dead old man." Marcus held up his phone. "I've got photos and video of an underground river that's flowing beneath your feet right now. I've got water samples that prove it's pure enough to supply cities. And I've got a story about a developer who's trying to steal the solution to the water crisis for private profit. How long do you think your investors will stand by you when that story hits the news?" The silence stretched between them, broken only by the desert wind and Ember's heavy breathing. Dalton's eyes narrowed, calculating, weighing whether Marcus was bluffing, whether the evidence was real, whether the risk was worth it. Finally Dalton spoke, his voice cold. "You have nothing. Some photos in the dark, some water in a bottle. That doesn't prove an aquifer. Doesn't prove anything except that there's moisture in an old mine. By the time any investigation happens, this land will be legally mine and you'll be a trespasser who'll face criminal charges if you come back." Sheriff Coleman moved forward again, hand now definitely on his weapon. "Mr. Webb, this is your last warning." Marcus looked at Tommy, at Ember, at the barren land that had become the most important place in his world. They were beaten, at least for now. Dalton had won this round. But as Marcus gathered what little he had and prepared to leave, he noticed something. Rita Callahan's truck was parked on the ridge overlooking the property, and the woman herself stood beside it with what looked like a video camera pointed in their direction. She'd been filming everything, recording Dalton's threats and Marcus's claims about the aquifer. Their eyes met across the distance, and Rita nodded once. A small gesture, but it told Marcus everything he needed to know. The fight wasn't over. It was just beginning, and this time the whole world was going to be watching. Marcus sat in the corner booth at the Dusty Saddle Saloon, his hands wrapped around a mug of coffee that had gone cold an hour ago. The bar was nearly empty, just a few regulars nursing beers and pretending not to stare at the man who'd lost everything in a single morning. Sundown had come and gone, and with it Marcus's legal right to stand on the property his uncle had died protecting. Dalton Pierce owned it now, every worthless acre, every secret it held. Rita slid into the booth across from him, setting her camera on the scarred wooden table. She looked tired, her limp more pronounced than usual, but her eyes held a fire that Marcus envied. He felt hollowed out, a shell of the determination that had carried him into that mine just hours before. "I got everything on video," Rita said without preamble. "Dalton threatening you, the sheriff acting as his personal enforcer, your claims about the aquifer. I've already sent copies to 3 different news stations in Reno and Las Vegas, plus uploaded it to every social media platform I could think of. By morning, this will be everywhere." Marcus shook his head slowly. "Won't matter. Dalton will have his lawyers claim I'm a disgruntled trespasser making wild accusations. Without independent verification of the aquifer, it's just my word against his money. Rita leaned forward, her voice dropping low. Then we get verification. We force their hand before Dalton can seal off the mine and hide what's down there. How? Marcus asked, hearing the defeat in his own voice. I don't own the land anymore. Can't authorize surveys or testing. And any expert willing to investigate would need permission from Dalton, which he'll never give. Tommy appeared then, sliding into the booth beside Rita. His face was flushed, eyes bright with something that might have been hope or madness. I've been making calls, he said, to everyone I could think of. Environmental groups, water conservation organizations, tribal councils. The aquifer you found, if it's as big as your uncle thought, it doesn't just matter for Nevada. That water could be connected to sources that feed half the Southwest. There are laws about that, federal protections for water systems that cross state lines. Marcus wanted to feel hope, but exhaustion and loss had numbed him. Even if that's true, it'll take months or years to prove. Dalton will have drilled by then, tapped into the aquifer, claimed water rights through a dozen shell companies. By the time anyone stops him, the damage will be done. The door to the saloon opened and a woman entered, her presence immediately commanding attention. She was in her 60s, Native American, with silver threading through her long dark hair. She wore a simple shirt and jeans, but carried herself with an authority that made people instinctively straighten. She walked directly to their booth, her eyes finding Marcus. "You're Frank Webb's nephew," she said. It wasn't a question. Marcus nodded, too surprised to speak. "My name is Margaret So. I'm with the Paiute Tribal Council. Your uncle contacted us 5 years ago about the aquifer he'd discovered. He believed it was part of an ancient water system our ancestors knew about, one that's mentioned in our oral histories but dismissed by modern geologists. We wanted to investigate, but by the time we arranged funding, Frank had disappeared into his obsession and wouldn't let anyone help him." Marcus felt something shift in his chest, the first stirring of hope. "You believed him?" Margaret pulled a chair from another table and sat down. "Our people have lived in this desert for thousands of years. We know things about the land that your science is only beginning to understand. There are stories about a great river that flows beneath the earth, fed by the tears of mountains, sustaining life even when the surface world burns. Frank believed he'd found that river. From what I saw on the video Rita sent me tonight, he was right." Rita had sent the video to tribal councils. Marcus looked at her with new appreciation. The woman had moved faster than he'd given her credit for. Margaret continued, her voice measured but urgent. "If that aquifer is what we believe it is, it falls under tribal water rights established by federal treaty. The land may belong to Dalton Pierce, but the water doesn't. It belongs to the people, to the ecosystem, to the future. But we need proof, and we need it before Dalton can establish his own claims." "How?" Marcus asked. "He owns the property. He can keep everyone out, can seal the mine, can hide the evidence until it's too late." Margaret smiled, and there was something fierce in it. "He owns the surface rights. But mineral rights in Nevada are complex, especially on land that was once mining territory. And more importantly, our treaty rights supersede property law when it comes to water sources that predate American ownership. If we can demonstrate that the aquifer exists and is connected to tribal lands, we can force an immediate federal investigation. Dalton's ownership becomes irrelevant." Tommy leaned forward, excitement building in his voice. "The video Marcus took, the water sample, isn't that enough to start an investigation?" Margaret shook her head. "Suggestive but not conclusive. Dalton's lawyers will argue it shows nothing more than groundwater seepage in an old mine. What we need is evidence that the aquifer is extensive, connected to other water systems, significant enough to warrant federal protection. And we need it documented by someone whose credentials can't be questioned." Marcus felt the weight of impossibility settling over him again. Where are we supposed to find someone like that willing to sneak onto Dalton's property and risk arrest? "You're not," said a new voice from the bar. An older man stood up from where he'd been sitting alone, nursing what looked like whiskey. He was perhaps 70, lean and weathered, with the kind of face that spoke of decades spent outdoors. "I am," The man walked over, and Marcus recognized him from his brief time in Silver Ridge. Doc Anderson, the veterinarian people said was washed up, spending more time drunk than practicing. But the man who stood before them now had clear eyes and steady hands. "I'm not just a vet," Doc Anderson said. "Used to be a hydrogeologist before I switched careers. Worked for the USGS for 20 years mapping aquifer systems across the Southwest. I know what I'm looking at when it comes to underground water." "Then why are you here getting drunk in Silver Ridge?" Rita asked, her skepticism obvious. Doc Anderson's expression darkened. "Because I wrote a report 15 years ago about water depletion in the Colorado River Basin, about how unchecked development and corporate water grabs were going to destroy the ecosystem. My bosses buried it. Told me to change my findings to make it less alarming. When I refused, they reassigned me to a desk job until I couldn't stand it anymore. I quit, tried to start over as a vet, and found out that sometimes fighting the good fight just means losing everything." He sat down heavily, and Marcus saw in the man's eyes a reflection of his own exhaustion, the bone-deep weariness that came from battling systems designed to crush people like them. "But I'm not dead yet," Doc Anderson continued. "And if Frank Webb really found what I think he found, if there's an aquifer down there that could save this region from the water wars that are coming, then maybe I can do one last thing that matters. Maybe I can finish the fight I started 15 years ago." Margaret placed a hand on the table, drawing everyone's attention. "Then here's what we do. Tomorrow night, while Dalton's people are setting up security around the property, we go in. Doc Anderson verifies the aquifer, documents it properly. We get samples, measurements, everything needed for a federal filing. Rita films everything for the public record. And we move fast, before Dalton realizes what's happening." "That's trespassing," Tommy said. "We'll all be arrested." Margaret's smile was grim. "Better to ask forgiveness than permission. And once we have the evidence, once it's public and filed with federal authorities, arresting us becomes a political nightmare for Dalton. He'll have to back down or face a fight he can't win." Marcus looked around the table at these people who had somehow become allies in a fight none of them had asked for. Rita with her camera and her refusal to let injustice hide in shadows. Tommy carrying guilt that had transformed into purpose. Margaret defending rights that stretched back centuries. Doc Anderson seeking redemption for battles lost long ago. And somewhere outside in the darkness, Ember waited, the horse who had started all of this by refusing to die. "I'm in," Marcus said. "Whatever happens, I'm done running." The planning took most of the night. They spread maps across the booth table, compared notes, identified the best approach to the mine that would avoid Dalton's security. Doc Anderson listed the equipment he'd need, most of which he still had gathering dust in his garage. Rita charged her camera batteries and prepared backup recording devices. Margaret made calls to lawyers and tribal officials, putting pieces in motion that would trigger federal involvement the moment they had solid evidence. As dawn approached, Marcus stepped outside the saloon. The desert air was cool, that brief window before the sun turned everything into an furnace. He walked to where he'd parked his truck and found Ember standing beside it. The horse had followed him from the property, refusing to be left behind even when the sheriff had ordered Marcus to leave. Now she stood in the empty parking lot, patient and steadfast, waiting for whatever came next. Marcus stroked her neck, feeling the solid warmth of her. "You started all this," he told her quietly. "Uncle Frank listened to you when everyone said he was crazy. You led me down into that mine, showed me what he'd been protecting. Now we're going to finish it. We're going to make sure your river stays free." Ember's ear swiveled toward him, and she pressed her muzzle against his chest in that gesture that had become familiar. Marcus wrapped his arms around her neck and allowed himself a moment of vulnerability, of fear about what the next day would bring. They were planning to break the law, to trespass on Dalton's property, to gather evidence that would destroy a powerful man's plans. If it went wrong, they'd all face criminal charges. If it went right, they'd be challenging systems of wealth and power that had crushed better people than them. But standing there with Ember as the sky began to lighten, Marcus thought about Emma and her stubborn refusal to surrender. He thought about Uncle Frank dying poor but unbroken. He thought about all the people across the Southwest facing a future where water became more valuable than gold, where desperation would drive conflict and suffering. If they could stop that, even partially, even for a little while, wasn't it worth the risk? The day passed in tense preparation. Marcus tried to rest but couldn't, his mind racing through everything that could go wrong. Tommy acquired supplies and helped Doc Anderson organize his equipment. Rita scouted the property from a distance, identifying security patrols and timing their routes. Margaret worked phones and computers, building a legal framework that would support them once they had evidence. As sunset approached, they gathered at an abandoned homestead 3 miles from the Webb property. Doc Anderson arrived with equipment cases, professional gear that looked expensive and well-maintained despite years of disuse. Rita had her camera and multiple backup batteries. Tommy brought rope, lights, and climbing gear. Margaret had documents ready to file the moment they gave her the word. Marcus looked at Ember, who had stayed close all day. "You can't come this time, girl. It's too dangerous and we need to move fast." But even as he said it, Marcus knew the truth. Ember had led them this far. Leaving her behind felt like denying the very instinct that had brought them to this moment. And more practically, having the horse who could sense the aquifer might help Doc Anderson identify the best locations for sampling and measurement. "She comes," Doc Anderson said, as if reading Marcus's thoughts. "I've seen enough weird things in my life to trust when an animal knows something we don't. If that horse wants to show me where to test, I'm going to listen." They moved out as darkness fell, approaching the property from the north where the terrain was roughest and security most sparse. Marcus led with Ember following close, the horse's hooves nearly silent on the rocky ground. They avoided the main approaches, instead climbing through gullies and over ridges that would have been impossible in daylight. Tommy and Rita followed, while Doc Anderson brought up the rear, moving with surprising grace for his age. Twice they had to freeze and wait as security vehicles passed on distant roads, headlights sweeping across the landscape. Dalton had moved fast, bringing in a professional security team within hours of taking possession. But professional didn't mean perfect, and they found gaps in the patrol pattern that allowed them to reach the mine entrance undetected. The tunnel mouth yawned before them, darker than the night around it. Doc Anderson paused at the entrance, running a hand over the old timber supports, examining the water stains Marcus had noticed before. His expression shifted from curiosity to excitement. "This is real," he murmured. "I can see the mineral deposits, the flow patterns. There's a significant water source nearby." They descended into the earth, moving as quickly as safety allowed. Marcus led them through the turns and branches he'd navigated before, Tommy managing the rope on steep sections, Rita filming everything with a light attachment on her camera. Ember moved with confidence, never hesitating, as if she'd walked these tunnels 1,000 times. When they reached the chamber where Marcus had made his discovery, Doc Anderson immediately began his work. He set up portable testing equipment, collected samples, took measurements of flow rate and volume based on sound resonance. He photographed mineral deposits and mapped the visible extent of the underground river. His hands moved with practiced precision, and Marcus could see decades of expertise emerging from years of forced dormancy. "This is it," Doc Anderson said after 30 minutes of intense investigation. "This is the aquifer system I theorized about 15 years ago, the one my bosses said didn't exist. It's fed by the Sierra Nevada snowpack, filtered through hundreds of miles of limestone, emerging here in a channel that probably connects to other systems throughout the region. The volume," he paused, taking more measurements, "the volume is extraordinary. This could supply water for millions of people for generations." Rita captured everything on video, Doc Anderson's explanations, the river itself, the testing procedures that would satisfy scientific scrutiny. Tommy helped collect samples in sealed containers that Doc Anderson labeled with careful precision. And Ember stood at the edge of the underground shore, looking out over the water as if guarding it. Marcus felt something loosen in his chest, a tension he'd been carrying since the day he received his uncle's inheritance letter. They'd done it. They had proof that would stand up to any challenge, evidence that couldn't be dismissed or explained away. Uncle Frank had been right about everything, and now the world would know. But as they prepared to leave, As Doc Anderson packed his equipment and Rita conducted a final sweep with her camera, they heard sounds from above. Voices echoing down the tunnel, multiple people moving fast. Someone had discovered their intrusion. "We need to go," Marcus said urgently. Now, they scrambled toward the tunnel that led upward, but within minutes they could see flashlight beams descending toward them. Dalton's security team moving to cut them off. The group stopped, trapped between the underground river and the approaching guards. "There's another way," Tommy said suddenly. "When I was helping your uncle, he showed me a side tunnel. Said it was unstable, but it leads to a different exit on the far side of the property." Doc Anderson shook his head. "If it's unstable, we could trigger a collapse. Bury ourselves down here. Better than getting caught before we can get this evidence out," Rita said. She looked at Marcus. "Your call." Marcus looked at Ember, and the horse was already moving, heading toward a narrow passage Marcus had barely noticed. Once again, she knew something they didn't. He made his decision. Follow Ember. Trust her like Uncle Frank did. They plunged into the side tunnel, leaving behind the approaching security team. The passage was narrow, forcing them to move single file, and in places the ceiling had partially collapsed, requiring them to squeeze through gaps that scraped skin and tore clothing. Behind them they could hear shouting, the security team discovering the chamber and the evidence of their testing. The tunnel twisted and descended, taking them deeper into the earth. Marcus's heart hammered with fear that Tommy had been wrong, that this was a dead end, that they'd trapped themselves in a tomb of stone. But Ember never hesitated, pushing forward even when the path seemed impossible. And then, after what felt like hours but was probably only 20 minutes, Marcus saw stars. An opening, partially concealed by scrub brush, leading out onto the desert floor on the far side of the property. They emerged one by one, gasping in the night air, covered in dust and blood from a dozen small cuts. Marcus did a quick count. Everyone had made it out. Doc Anderson still had his equipment cases. Rita still had her camera. Tommy had the sample containers. They'd gotten away with everything they needed. Behind them they could hear the security team still searching the tunnels, shouting orders, confused about where their quarry had disappeared. Marcus allowed himself a brief smile. Dalton Pierce had underestimated them, had assumed they'd be easy to catch. But they'd learned from Ember, had trusted in instincts and knowledge that existed outside boardrooms and legal briefs. They hiked through the darkness back to their vehicles, exhaustion making every step a challenge. Dawn was breaking by the time they reached the abandoned homestead where they'd started. Margaret was waiting, phone in hand, lawyers on. "Stand by." The moment she saw Doc Anderson's nod of confirmation, she began making calls. Within an hour, federal officials had been notified. The evidence was being uploaded to multiple servers, backed up, made impossible to suppress or destroy. Rita's video went live on social media, spreading across the internet faster than Dalton's PR team could respond. News stations picked up the story, sending reporters scrambling toward Silver Ridge to cover what was already being called the discovery of the century. Marcus sat on the hood of his truck, watching the sun rise over the desert that had tried so hard to kill him and Ember both. The horse stood beside him, her coat golden in the early light, and Marcus ran his hand along her neck one more time. "We did it, girl. Uncle Frank would be proud." The weeks that followed were chaos. Federal investigators descended on the property, confirming Doc Anderson's findings and expanding them. The aquifer was even larger than anyone had suspected, a massive system that connected to water sources across 4 states. Environmental groups filed lawsuits blocking Dalton's development plans. Tribal councils asserted their treaty rights. The story dominated news cycles, and Marcus found himself thrust into a spotlight he'd never wanted. Dalton Pierce fought back with lawyers and money, but the evidence was overwhelming and the public outcry immense. His investors abandoned him, his political allies distanced themselves, and eventually criminal investigations began into how he'd acquired the property and what he'd known about the aquifer when he did. The man who had seemed invincible crumbled under the weight of his own greed. The property itself was tied up in legal proceedings that would take years to resolve, but interim orders protected the aquifer from any development or drilling. Margaret and the tribal councils negotiated agreements that would ensure the water remained a public resource, managed for the benefit of communities rather than corporate profit. Doc Anderson was hired as a consultant, finally able to use his expertise for the purpose he'd always intended. Tommy found work with environmental organizations. His guilt transformed into a career protecting what mattered. Rita won awards for her journalism, her camera having captured the moment when ordinary people stood against power and won. And Marcus, he eventually returned to Arizona, using money from the story rights to save his ranch. But he brought Ember with him, the horse who had refused to die, who had known secrets the earth tried to keep, who had led them all toward something bigger than survival. She lived out her days in green pastures, no longer fighting for every breath, no longer abandoned or forgotten. Sometimes Marcus would stand at the fence and watch her run, remembering the dying creature he'd found in his uncle's barn, remembering the journey into darkness that had brought them both back to the light. Frank Webb had left him an inheritance that looked worthless but contained everything that mattered. Not money or property, but purpose. The knowledge that some things were worth fighting for even when the fight seemed impossible. The understanding that miracles sometimes arrived on shaking legs with desperate eyes, asking only that someone care enough to notice. The aquifer continued to flow beneath the desert, a river in the darkness, sustaining life the way it had for thousands of years. And somewhere in the network of tunnels and chambers, in places humans would never reach, the water sang its ancient song, a reminder that beneath the surface of things, beneath the dust and heat and apparent desolation, there were always hidden treasures waiting to be discovered by those brave enough to look. Marcus never forgot the lesson Ember had taught him, the same lesson his uncle had learned in his final years. That worth isn't determined by what others see in you, but by what you refuse to surrender even when the world says you should quit. That sometimes the most valuable things in life look worthless until someone cares enough to see them for what they truly are. And that inheritance isn't just about what's left behind, but about having the courage to carry forward the fights that others started, to protect what matters even when protection costs everything. The desert remembered, the water flowed, and in a barn in Arizona, a horse who should have died stood strong, a living monument to the power of stubborn hope and the miracles that happen when you refuse to give up on things everyone else has abandoned. 3 years had passed since the night Marcus and his unlikely team had descended into the earth and emerged with proof that would change everything. The legal battles had finally concluded, the last appeals dismissed, the final settlements reached. The aquifer was now protected under federal law, managed by a coalition of tribal councils, environmental groups, and state agencies. Dalton Pierce had fled the country facing fraud charges, his empire dismantled piece by piece as investigators uncovered decades of corruption and exploitation. Marcus stood on the porch of his Arizona ranch, watching the morning sun paint the landscape in shades of amber and gold. The property looked different now, healthier somehow, as if the weight of desperation had lifted and allowed everything to breathe. New fences lined the pastures, the barn had been rebuilt, and in the fields his small herd of cattle grazed on grass that actually grew instead of merely surviving. The money from the aquifer story had saved this place, but more than that, it had given Marcus something he'd thought died with Emma. It had given him a future worth building. In the nearest pasture, Ember grazed peacefully alongside 2 younger horses Marcus had acquired last spring. The mare was older now, her muzzle showing gray, but she moved with grace and strength that belied the dying creature she'd once been. Sometimes Marcus still marveled at the transformation, still remembered those first desperate days in the Nevada desert when every breath she took seemed like it might be her last. Now she was a legend, the horse who'd found a fortune, featured in documentaries and news stories that Marcus had long since stopped counting. But to Marcus she was simply Ember, the companion who'd walked beside him through darkness and back into light. Every morning he brought her an apple. Every evening he checked on her before bed. And sometimes late at night when sleep wouldn't come he'd walk out to the pasture and just stand with her under the stars, remembering everything they'd survived together. A truck turned onto the long drive leading to the ranch house, dust trailing behind it. Marcus recognized the vehicle and smiled. Tommy Vega had become a regular visitor over the past few years, checking in on Marcus and Ember, bringing news from Nevada and the ongoing work to protect not just the aquifer they discovered but other water sources. Throughout the region, the young man had found his calling in conservation work. His guilt over spying for Dalton transformed into passionate advocacy for environmental protection. Tommy climbed out of the truck, grinning as he approached the porch. He looked different than he had that night in the mine, more confident, wearing the kind of peace that came from knowing you'd found your purpose. He carried a folder under his arm and his eyes were bright with news. "You're not going to believe this," Tommy said without preamble. "Margaret just got confirmation. They've found 3 more aquifer systems in the region, all connected to the one Ember led us to. The network is even bigger than Doc Anderson thought. We're talking about enough water to sustain the entire Southwest for centuries if it's managed properly." Marcus felt his chest tighten with emotion. "Uncle Frank knew," he said quietly. Somehow he understood that what Ember had found was just the beginning. Tommy sat on the porch steps, setting the folder beside him. "There's more. The tribal councils and state governments are establishing a new management framework, one that prioritizes sustainability over profit. They want to name it after your uncle, the Frank Webb Aquifer Conservation System. Margaret thought you should be the one to approve it." Marcus looked out at Ember, at the horse who had started all of this by simply refusing to die in a place everyone considered worthless. His uncle had spent his final years being called crazy, dying poor and alone, his obsessions dismissed by everyone who knew him. Now his name would be attached to one of the most important water conservation efforts in American history. The irony wasn't lost on Marcus. "He'd love that," Marcus said. "Not for the recognition, but because it means he was right. All those years of fighting, of holding on to that land when everyone told him to sell, it mattered. He mattered." Tommy opened the folder and pulled out documents. "There's something else. The property, the original Webb homestead in Nevada, it's been held in trust pending the final legal resolution. Now that everything's settled, ownership reverts to you. It's yours, Marcus. All 200 acres. Protected by conservation easements that prevent any development but allow you to live there if you choose." Marcus took the papers, his hands trembling slightly as he read through the legal language. His uncle's land, the place where this entire journey had begun, was his again. Not to profit from, not to develop, but to steward. To protect the way Frank had tried to protect it, the way Ember had shown them it deserved. "I don't know if I can go back there," Marcus admitted. "Too many ghosts, too many memories of fighting battles that should have killed us." "You don't have to decide now," Tommy said. "But the option's there." And Margaret mentioned something else. "The tribal councils want to establish a visitor center near the property. A place where people can learn about the aquifer, about the history of water in the desert, about your uncle's fight to protect it. They'd want your input, maybe even ask you to be involved in running it." Marcus sat down on the porch steps beside Tommy, feeling the weight of possibility. He'd come to Nevada 3 years ago with nothing, a broke rancher facing foreclosure, inheriting land he'd assumed was worthless. Now he had options, opportunities, a story that had touched people across the country. But more than that, he had proof that Emma had been right. Starting over wasn't about running away with a different zip code. It was about finding the courage to build something new on top of the rubble of what had been lost. "Let me think about it," Marcus said. "Talk to some people, figure out what makes sense." Tommy nodded and stood to leave, but paused at his truck. "Marcus, I never properly thanked you. For giving me a chance that night at the saloon. For letting me be part of something that mattered. I was drowning in guilt and shame, and you pulled me out without even realizing it." "We all pulled each other out," Marcus replied. "That's what I learned from all this. Nobody saves themselves alone. We needed each other, every single person who showed up that night. Take any one of us away and the whole thing falls apart." After Tommy drove away, Marcus walked out to the pasture where Ember stood in the shade of an old cottonwood tree. The horse lifted her head as he approached, ears forward, that familiar intelligence in her dark eyes. Marcus ran his hand along her neck, feeling the solid warmth of her, and made a decision that had been forming since Tommy handed him those papers. "What do you think, girl?" he asked. "Ready for one more adventure? We could go back to Nevada, help build that visitor center." Make sure Uncle Frank's story gets told right. Make sure people understand what you showed us about listening to the land instead of just taking from it." Ember leaned into his touch, and Marcus chose to interpret that as agreement. The next weeks were a blur of planning and preparation. Marcus talked to Rita, who was now a respected investigative journalist but still took time to consult on the Nevada project. He spoke with Doc Anderson, who despite his age was still actively working on aquifer research and mapping. Margaret became a regular voice on the phone, discussing plans for the visitor center and how to make it both educational and reverent toward the water sources it would showcase. The biggest conversation came when Marcus called his neighbors in Arizona, the ranchers who'd helped him rebuild after the aquifer discovery had brought him financial stability. He explained his plan to spend several months each year in Nevada, working on the conservation center while maintaining his Arizona ranch. To his surprise, they not only supported the idea but offered to help manage his property during his absences. The community that had once watched him struggle now stood ready to support his next chapter. On a cool morning in October, Marcus loaded his truck with supplies and towed a horse trailer behind. Ember loaded easily, as comfortable with travel now as she'd once been with leading them through mine tunnels. They drove north through Arizona and into Nevada, watching the landscape shift from high desert grassland to the harder country around Dry Creek Valley. When Marcus turned onto the road leading to what had been his uncle's property, his throat tightened with emotion. The place looked different, cared for in ways it hadn't been during Frank's final struggling years. The tribal councils and conservation groups had stabilized the old buildings, cleaned up decades of accumulated neglect, and installed solar panels to provide power without disrupting the land. The barn had been reinforced and repaired, and someone had planted native grasses around the windmill that once barely functioned. But the biggest change was the fence line where the mine entrance sat on the hillside. What had been a dangerous opening boarded with rotting wood was now a secure but accessible entrance with proper safety measures. A small building nearby would house equipment and serve as a starting point for the educational tours that would eventually bring people down to see the aquifer system. Not to exploit it, but to understand it. To witness what existed beneath the surface and comprehend why protecting it mattered. Margaret met him at the barn. Her silver hair now completely gray but her eyes as sharp as ever. She embraced Marcus like family, then stepped back to look at Ember. "This horse changed everything," Margaret said. "Not just by leading you to the water, but by teaching us to pay attention to what we'd stopped seeing. My grandmother used to tell stories about animals who carried ancient knowledge, who understood the land in ways humans had forgotten. Most people dismissed those stories as myths, but Ember proved they were something else. They were remembering." Over the following months, Marcus worked alongside crews building the visitor center. He helped design exhibits that told his uncle's story without making him a martyr or a saint, just a man who'd seen something others missed and refused to let it go. They created displays about Ember, about the science of aquifers, about tribal water rights and the history of exploitation that had brought the Southwest to the brink of crisis. And they built a viewing platform above one of the access points to the underground river, a place where visitors could look down into the earth and see the water flowing, pristine and powerful, through channels carved by time. Rita came to document the construction, producing a series of articles about the project that brought attention and donors. Doc Anderson consulted on the scientific accuracy of the exhibits, making sure the information presented was rigorous enough to satisfy experts while remaining accessible to ordinary visitors. Tommy coordinated with youth groups and schools, developing educational programs that would bring the next generation to understand why water conservation wasn't just important but existential. On a spring morning 1 year after Marcus returned to Nevada, the Frank Webb Aquifer Conservation Center opened to the public. Hundreds of people attended the ceremony, far more than anyone had anticipated. There were tribal elders and environmental activists, scientists and ranchers, students and journalists. The governor of Nevada gave a speech about the importance of water stewardship. Margaret spoke about treaty rights and the responsibility to protect resources for future generations. Doc Anderson explained the science in terms that made people gasp with understanding. But the moment that broke Marcus was when they unveiled a statue near the visitor center entrance. It depicted a man standing beside a horse, both of them looking toward distant hills. The man's face was weathered, determined, carrying the kind of stubborn hope that refused to quit even when quitting made sense. The horse's head was lifted, alert, as if sensing something others couldn't perceive. A plaque at the base read simply, "Frank Webb and Ember. They taught us to listen." Marcus stood before that statue with tears running down his face, remembering the envelope that had arrived on the worst day of his life. The inheritance he'd assumed was worthless. The uncle he'd barely known who'd left him something infinitely more valuable than money. Frank had left him a purpose, a fight, and the knowledge that sometimes the most important things in life come disguised as burdens too heavy to carry. That evening, after the crowds had dispersed and the staff had gone home, Marcus walked Ember up to the overlook where they could see the whole valley spread below. The desert was blooming after spring rains, wildflowers painting the landscape in unexpected colors. In the distance, the old homestead sat peaceful under the stars, and somewhere beneath their feet the aquifer flowed, singing its ancient song. Marcus thought about Emma, about how she told him that surrender was a choice and fighting even when you knew you'd lose was better than giving up. He thought about his Uncle Frank, dying poor but unbroken, his obsessions validated only after death. He thought about all the people who'd gathered around this fight, who'd risked everything to protect something they'd never profit from. And he thought about Ember, the horse who should have died but chose instead to live, to lead, to show them all what mattered. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of sage and earth, and Ember pressed her muzzle against Marcus's shoulder. He wrapped his arm around her neck and spoke into the darkness. "We did it, girl. Not just found the water, but protected it. Made sure it'll be here for people who aren't even born yet." Uncle Frank would say that's what inheritance really means. Not what you get, but what you leave behind that's worth protecting. Ember's ear swiveled toward him, listening the way she always listened, and Marcus laughed softly. "You know something? 3 years ago I thought I'd lost everything. Turned out I hadn't lost anything. I just hadn't found it yet. Had to drive into the desert and meet a dying horse to figure out what my life was supposed to be about." He stayed there until the stars filled the sky completely, until the desert had settled into its nighttime rhythms, until peace had settled so deeply into his bones that he barely recognized himself as the desperate man who'd arrived here believing he was at the end. That man had been wrong. He hadn't been at the end. He'd been at the beginning, standing on the edge of something that would transform not just his life but the lives of countless others who would never know his name. The Frank Webb Aquifer Conservation Center became a model for similar projects across the Southwest. Other communities began paying attention to their water sources, began listening to tribal knowledge and scientific expertise instead of just corporate promises. Policy changed, laws were strengthened, and slowly, incrementally, the relationship between people and water began to shift from exploitation toward stewardship. Marcus split his time between Arizona and Nevada, building a life that honored both the past and the future. He never remarried, never looked for someone to fill the space Emma had left. But he found companionship in the work, in the community that formed around protecting what mattered, in the knowledge that his days meant something beyond his own survival. And Ember, she lived to an age that surprised the veterinarians, as if her early brush with death had taught her body how to hold on longer than expected. She spent her final years in the pasture beside the visitor center, a living reminder of where the whole journey had started. Children came to see her, touched by her story, and Marcus watched them press their small hands against her neck with reverence usually reserved for sacred things. When Ember finally passed, on a quiet autumn morning with Marcus beside her, he buried her on the ridge overlooking the aquifer. The tribal councils held a ceremony, honoring her in ways that acknowledged what she'd been. Not just an animal but a teacher, a guide, a keeper of knowledge that had saved them all. They planted a cottonwood tree over her grave, and Margaret explained that in Paiute tradition, cottonwoods growing near water were sacred, bridges between the visible world and the deeper truths that sustained life. Marcus visited that grave often in the months that followed, talking to Ember the way he'd talked to her in life, telling her about the work continuing at the center, about the people who still asked about her, about the way her story had taken on a life of its own. And sometimes, standing there under the cottonwood's growing branches, Marcus felt something that might have been Ember's presence, or might have been his own transformed understanding of what it meant to leave a legacy. Years continued to pass and Marcus grew older. His hair turned fully gray. His body accumulated new aches to go with old injuries, but his purpose never wavered. The visitor center thrived, educating thousands each year about water conservation and the importance of listening to land instead of dominating it. The aquifer remained protected, its water flowing freely, sustaining ecosystems and communities that had learned to value it properly. On the anniversary of the night, they descended into the mine and emerged with evidence that changed everything. Marcus stood at the viewing platform above the underground river. He was 70 now, his shoulder permanently stiff, his hands gnarled from a lifetime of physical work. But his eyes were clear and his heart was full as he looked down at the water flowing through its ancient channels. A young couple stood nearby, tourists from California, reading the plaques that told the story. The woman turned to Marcus, recognizing him from the photos in the exhibit. "You're him," she said. "You're the one who found the aquifer." Marcus shook his head gently. "I didn't find it. It was always here. I just learned to listen to someone who knew where to look." "The horse," the man said. "Ember. The one they made the statue of." Marcus nodded. "She taught me that worth isn't about what others see in you, but about what you refuse to give up on. She was dying when I found her, abandoned in the desert, and everyone said she wasn't worth saving. Turned out she was worth everything." The couple moved on, but their conversation lingered with Marcus. He thought about all the things Ember had been worth. The aquifer she'd led them to, yes, but more than that. The community that had formed around protecting it. The lives changed by learning her story. The shift in how people thought about water and land and responsibility. All of that had started with one stubborn decision to save a dying horse that logic said should be left to nature. As the sun set over Dry Creek Valley, painting the desert in colors that took Marcus's breath away even after years of witnessing it, he felt Emma's presence as strongly as he ever had. She would have loved this, he thought. Would have loved seeing what came from refusing to surrender, from choosing to fight even when the fight seemed impossible. Marcus walked slowly back to his truck, his body tired but his spirit soaring. Tomorrow he'd return to the visitor center, would talk to more tourists, would work on expanding the educational programs, would continue the fight to protect water resources that remained threatened despite everything they'd accomplished. There was always more work, always another battle, always people who valued profit over preservation. But tonight, Marcus was content. He'd inherited worthless land and a dying horse, and together they'd found a fortune that couldn't be measured in dollars. They'd found purpose, community, and proof that sometimes the things everyone dismisses as hopeless are actually the seeds of miracles waiting for someone brave enough to nurture them. The stars emerged one by one over the desert, the same stars that had watched over Ember's grave on the ridge, the same stars that had guided them through that long-ago night when everything changed. And somewhere beneath the earth, in channels carved by millennia of patient water, the aquifer continued its ancient flow, protected now, understood now, valued now in ways Frank Webb had dreamed of but never lived to see. Marcus drove toward the homestead with his windows down, breathing in the desert air, carrying with him the weight and wonder of inheritance properly understood. Not what you receive, but what you protect. Not what enriches you, but what you refuse to let others destroy. Not the fortune you find, but the fortune you become by choosing to fight for things that matter more than your own survival. Behind him, the visitor center lights glowed in the darkness, a beacon of hope in a world that desperately needed reminding that some things were worth protecting at any cost. And on the ridge, under the growing cottonwood tree, Ember rested in earth she'd helped save, her legacy flowing eternal in the water beneath the desert floor. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.